Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less. That's Marie Curie, of course. And welcome to the Deep Dive. We take the sources you need to know about, pull out the key insights, and basically make you well-informed, fast. Today, our mission is a deep dive, a really important one based on a recent piece in The Wire. We're looking at India's, well, ambitious push to revive its nuclear energy program. And look, this isn't just some abstract policy discussion. It's super relevant if you're a UPSC aspirant, tackling mains current affairs or maybe prepping for prelims. And honestly, even if you're just curious about where India's energy future is headed. Now, what's fascinating globally speaking is this shift. For ages, it felt like the net zero conversation was all renewables, 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 and solar wind. But hang on, there's a bit of a recalculation happening. We're seeing this maybe surprising renewed interest in nuclear power around the world. And it's not just baseline demand driving it. It's things like these massive data centers needed for AI, and cryptocurrencies too. They just consume so much power constantly.
Yeah, they're power hogs, absolutely.
Exactly. So it's this recognition, I think, that while renewables are vital, absolutely, they fluctuate, right?
Yeah.
You need that steady, reliable baseload power.
Mm-hmm.
And nuclear, well, despite all its complexities, it offers that high-density, nonstop power. It signals a more maybe pragmatic, diversified energy strategy emerging globally.
And that global pivot you mentioned, it really finds a strong echo here in India. Our energy situation, as you know, it's pretty unique, pretty complex.
Yeah.
Our electricity demand keeps climbing. We're talking, 6-7% growth annually, consistently, for years now.
Right, that's huge growth.
It is. And data centers, AI, that's just another layer on top of everything else. Industrial growth, more appliances, electric vehicles coming online. So the key thing here, the real shift from the source material, is how nuclear energy is being positioned now. Not just as an option, but maybe as a really fundamental part of India's future energy security solution.
That's a crucial framing. And looking at the sheer scale of India's ambition here, it's massive. The government's nuclear energy mission is not just talking about adding a few reactors. They're aiming to scale up nuclear power generation.
12-fold.
12 times. To 100 gigawatts by 2047. Now, you put that against where we are today. We have 24 units, combined capacity about 8.1 gigawatts.
Mm-hmm.
That's less than 2% of our total electricity right now. So going from under 2% to aiming for a capacity that could supply a huge chunk, it's, audacious is one word for it. Strategic, definitely.
It is audacious. And India's had a nuclear program for a long time, mostly indigenous, which is important. But expanding that base, historically, it's been slow, gradual. We've seen plans for big projects, some delays, and more recently, this talk about smaller reactors. But the source asks, what's changed to make the government feel confident about hitting the accelerator now?
Right. What's the trigger?
Well, the union budget for 2025-26 seems to be a key moment. The Wire article points to this. It wasn't just rhetoric. It marked a real shift in momentum. Actual resource allocation signaling that this ambition is now being seriously pursued. It feels like more than just talk this time.
And the budget did put some real meat on the bones, didn't it? Specific plans. It mentioned operationalizing 5 indigenously developed small modular reactors, SMRs, for 2033.
SMRs, yeah. That's the buzzword.
Exactly. And not just one size fits all. They're talking different configurations, 200 megawatt, 55 megawatt, even smaller 10 megawatt units. And there's an initial investment figure mentioned, RSS 20,000 crore. Plus, crucially, a framework to actually encourage the private sector to get involved. And even talk of repurposing some NTPC sites for these SMRs. That feels like a significant move to bring in players beyond the usual government entities.
Absolutely. That private sector angle is key. The government seems to be actively courting partnerships now. Part of that involves developing these things called Bharat small reactors, or BSRs. Basically, think of them as compact versions of India's existing pressurized heavy water reactors, the PHWRs.
Okay, so leveraging existing tech.
Precisely. PHWRs use heavy water. It's a technology India has deep indigenous expertise in. So these BSRs are like an evolution, scaled down from that proven base. And it's not just theoretical. The Nuclear Power Corporation of India, NPCIL, they've already put out requests for proposals, RFPs, to Indian industry.
Already?
Yeah, for deploying 220 milliW BSRs, specifically for captive use, like powering industrial parks or specific facilities. It shows they're trying to, get this rolling practically.
Captive use.
Yes.
Interesting. So maybe avoiding some of the grid integration complexities initially.
Could be part of the strategy, yeah. Get them built, prove the concept.
Right. But engaging private industry, especially in nuclear, that immediately brings up the let's call it the elephant in the room, liability. What happens if something goes wrong? Which takes us straight into India's legal framework, which is, well, unique and pretty heavily debated. It seems like it's both a foundation and potentially a major hurdle.
Definitely a hurdle, according to some stakeholders, particularly international ones.
And this is where those legislative and financial reforms become absolutely critical. You mentioned the source highlights a Parliamentary Standing Committee report.
Yes, they weighed in, recommending a robust financial framework specifically to attract investment, both domestic and international.
And crucially, they urged swift amendments to two key laws: the old Atomic Energy Act and probably the more contentious one, the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act, the CLNDA.
The CLNDA from 2010.
They see amending these as basically essential to unlock that private participation everyone agrees is needed to hit those huge targets.
Right. And to understand why these acts are so pivotal, maybe a quick look back is helpful. The Atomic Energy Act, from way back in 1962, it's the backbone. But it got criticized over the years for not really having strong enough provisions for civil liability if an accident happened. Who pays? How much? It was murky.
Okay.
So the CLNDA came in 2010 specifically to fill those gaps. The goal was clear: set up a proper system for liability and compensation. It defines nuclear damage pretty broadly: loss of life, injury, property damage, and fundamentally it aligned India with international norms by putting the main responsibility, the primary liability, onto the nuclear operator.
The operator.
Okay.
Not necessarily the company that supplied the equipment.
Not directly, no, we'll get to that nuance. But the operator's first in line.
And this CLNDA wasn't just about domestic policy, was it? The source emphasizes its international significance.
Hugely significant. India isn't actually party to the main international liability conventions, but passing its own robust law was seen as absolutely key to getting U.S. private companies involved.
Companies like GE, Westinghouse.
Exactly. They needed these liability protections, basically, to get insurance back home in the U.S. Without the CLNDA, the landmark 2008 Indo-U.S. Civil Nuclear Agreement, which opened the door for this collaboration, probably couldn't have been fully implemented.
So the CLNDA was a kind of linchpin for that deal.
It really was, which makes the current talk about amending it quite sensitive.
Okay, so what are the proposed amendments about? Why change something that was seemingly so crucial?
Well, the argument from the government side, as reported, is that the current CLNDA is actually acting as a barrier, an obstacle to faster international collaboration and therefore slowing down that needed capacity expansion.
How so?
The really contentious points relate to supplier liability and compensation caps. The existing law, interestingly, doesn't actually set an upper limit, a ceiling, on the total compensation amount or the duration of liability.
No ceiling at all.
Not explicitly in the act for the total quantum beyond the operator government share, but the draft law, prepared by the Department of Atomic Energy, apparently proposes changes, like capping the amount an operator can recover from a supplier, that recourse we mentioned, maybe limiting it to the original contract value, and introducing a time limit for making those claims against suppliers.
Okay, I see. That would certainly make suppliers happier, presumably. Less open-ended risk.
Potentially, yes. But then you have the other side of the coin. The current CLNDA does cap the operator's liability that's set at Rs 100 crore.
Right.
If the damage costs more than that, the government steps in, but only up to the rupee equivalent of 300 million SDRs.
SDRs, special drawing rights.
Yeah, the IMF's international reserve asset. It's a basket of currencies, so it provides a relatively stable international value. That 300 million SDRs is roughly what? Rs 3,167 crore right now.
So operator pays up to 1,500 crore. Government covers the next chunk up to about 367 crore. What if a really, truly catastrophic accident costs more than that combined total?
That's the huge question. Is that total amount, roughly Rs 4,667 crore, actually adequate for a worst-case scenario? The source highlights this debate. Does it leave victims potentially undercompensated?
And what about the suppliers again? You said the act doesn't make them directly liable.
Correct. The liability rests primarily with the operator. Suppliers only come into the picture under Section 17, which deals with the operator's right of recourse.
Meaning the operator pays the victims first.
Yes, ensuring quicker compensation, hopefully.
And then the operator can try to recover some of those costs from a supplier, but only if certain conditions are met, like proving defects or willful negligence.
Exactly. So it's an indirect liability for suppliers. But even this indirect route, this right of recourse, is apparently seen as a major deterrent by by international suppliers. They prefer much clearer, limited liability, often channeling everything strictly through the operator, as in some international conventions.
So it's a real balancing act, protecting victims versus attracting suppliers needed for expansion.
Precisely. And the source is careful to present these different viewpoints impartially, which is important for you, the listener, to understand the complexity without us taking a side. It's not simple.
It definitely isn't
Yeah.
simple. Which brings us back to that core tension. If the CLNDA was designed for swift victim compensation and clear operator liability, do these proposed changes, especially anything that might weaken the operator's ability to get recourse from a potentially negligent supplier risk, undermining the original intent? Does it potentially dilute safety incentives?
That's the worry expressed by critics, yes.
Because we're talking about accelerating nuclear power, a technology that demands the absolute highest safety standards. And doing this while India is still, let's face it, heavily reliant on coal, nearly 75% of our electricity. So regulatory reforms are pushing nuclear as this cleaner, reliable baseload alternative. But the article raises that really critical question. Is amending the Atomic Energy Act to let private companies actually operate plants, not just supply parts, truly desirable?
A very big question.
Yeah. He's very careful thought. You can argue private sector brings efficiency, maybe innovation. But then there are huge concerns about oversight, security. It's nuclear energy, after all.
And tying this back to the CLNDA amendments, the fundamental point stressed is that any changes absolutely must not weaken the core structure that prioritizes victims. That structure was meant to ensure relatively quick compensation, minimizing those long, drawn-out legal battles about who was exactly at fault, which can leave victims waiting for years.
Right, the no-fault liability principle for the operator.
Exactly. Strict liability. The challenge is designing laws that maintain that vital safety and compensation focus, while still making participation feasible for the suppliers and investors needed to actually build the plants. It's threading a very fine needle.
And speaking of needing investors, let's talk finance. Because scaling up 12-fold to 100 gigawatts, that's not just an engineering feat. It's a colossal financial undertaking.
Monumental. Nuclear plants cost billions up front and take decades to pay back.
So finding competitive, sustainable financing isn't just nice to have. It's absolutely make or break for this whole plan.
No question.
And it's interesting, the source notes that nuclear power was actually excluded from India's 2022 framework for sovereign green bonds.
Yeah, that caused some debate at the time.
Seems counterintuitive given nuclear's low carbon. So a proposed solution mentioned is adopting a broader classification, maybe low carbon bonds instead of just green bonds, which would acknowledge nuclear's environmental credentials, certainly better than fossil fuels, and arguably more reliable in footprint than some renewables when you factor in manufacturing and land use. It would open up access to that crucial pool of climate-focused capital.
And on the industry side, is India actually ready to build these reactors at scale? The article brings in Dr. Anil Kakodkar's perspective.
Former Atomic Energy Commission chairman. Key figure. What does he say?
He's quite bullish on India's capability. He believes India can build reactors in fleet mode, basically, a standardized assembly line approach to speed things up and reduce costs.
Okay, so the technical capacity is there, potentially?
But he adds a crucial caveat. Industry needs assurance. They need confidence in long-term government policy and support if they're going to invest heavily in building up their own capacity for this fleet mode. He even suggests maybe considering concessions for nuclear, like purchase obligations, similar to what was done to kickstart the renewable sector. Guaranteeing a buyer for the power generated provides that long-term certainty investors crave.
That's an interesting parallel with renewables. And what about international models? Does the source mention any?
It briefly mentions France as a comparison point. Around 65% of their electricity comes from nuclear. But importantly, all those plants are operated by a single government-run entity, Électricité de France, EDF.
So a very different model from the public-private partnership India seems to be pursuing now.
Very different. It just highlights there isn't one single right way to develop a large nuclear sector. State-led, private-led partnerships. Different countries take different paths.
So wrapping this section up, the core message seems to be, as India ramps up its nuclear ambitions, the regulatory framework absolutely have to keep pace. And the focus must remain squarely on safety, on accountability, and on ensuring fair compensation if the worst happens. It's about public trust as much as megawatts.
Couldn't agree more. Trust is paramount in this sector.
Okay, let's try and summarize the key takeaways from our deep dive today. India clearly has huge nuclear energy goals, a major strategic shift focusing on SMRs and bringing in the private sector.
A big pivot.
But this path is, shall we say, complicated. There are significant legislative hurdles, especially around the CLNDA, and major financial challenges in securing investment and building confidence.
Absolutely. The liability issue looms large.
And underpinning it all is this constant balancing act, meeting India's massive energy needs, driving economic growth, but never, ever compromising on the most stringent safety standards.
And that's really why understanding this is so important for you, our listener. Whether you're tracking India's path to net zero, looking at sustainable development goals, or doing critical policy analysis, maybe especially for UPSC prep, this hits all those points. It's a live case study in the interplay of technology, law, finance, international relations, and national strategy. It impacts millions of lives, directly or indirectly.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over. As India reaches for this future of abundant, clean nuclear energy, how do we actually ensure that promise is fully realized? How do we guarantee the highest standards of safety and accountability, not just now, but for generations to come? It's a profound question, and one India is grappling with right now. Thank you for joining us on another deep dive. If this sparked questions or you have thoughts, please do like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. We really value your engagement. Thanks for being here.